The study that was conducted, basically, it focuses on parents' intentions to get their children vaccinated, and this particularly looks at children under the age of 18. So, to introduce this study, parents with children under the age of 18 were to determine whether or not they wanted to get their children vaccinated for COVID-19. By completing this study, there was a survey that was conducted that used theory of planned behavior. So, before I conducted this study, another researcher conducted this study, and their study focused on theory of planned behavior, predicting parents' intentions to vaccinate their children as well as themselves. Brandstetter was a researcher who conducted this study originally. And what he found was that negative parental attitudes regarding policy measures pertaining to the pandemic were associated with a lower intention to vaccinate. So I went ahead and I decided that I was going to go ahead and produce the same sort of study. And so also I conducted a study that used the variables of intention, which are attitude, perceived behavior control, and perceived normative pressure, which are all variables of theory of planned behavior. So, the study that was conducted by me asked participants a series of questions that fell under the category of attitude, perceived behavior control, perceived normative pressure, and intention. So, the purpose of this study is the theory of planned behavior is to focus on parents with children under the age of 18 and to predict their intentions from their attitude, perceived normative pressure, and perceived behavior control toward getting their child vaccinated for COVID-19. The hypothesis of this study, it predicts that attitude, perceived normative pressure, and perceived behavior control will combine to predict intention to get their child vaccinated for COVID-19. So before getting into the study, I want to present a model that basically gives the breakdown of theory of planned behavior. So to the left of the model is perceived normative pressure. Perceived normative pressure looks at the influence of experiencing pressure from important individuals in order to engage in a particular behavior. Perceived normative pressure has two components, which are injunctive and descriptive. Injunctive focuses on what important people in one's life expects them to do or not to do. Descriptive focuses on what those important individuals are doing or not doing themselves. At the top right is attitude. Attitude looks at how much an individual is personally engaging in that behavior, and it as well contains two components. These components are instrumental and experiential. Instrumental focuses cognitively and determines the consequences one may feel if engaging in that behavior. So next is methodology. So for the methods of this study that was conducted, it consisted of a survey being formed amongst 91 participants, and they were recruited through friends, family, and social media platforms. So the participants were told that they will be taking a survey to measure parents' attitudes and beliefs about their children getting vaccinated for COVID-19. So the participants had open access to a link, and they were then directed to a Qualtrics page. Participants were recruited by choosing family, friends, and using social media platforms to attract individuals with children under 18 in order to take the survey. The duration of the survey lasted for about 5 to 7 minutes, and after the survey was finished, participants were given a debrief just thanking them for their time as well as for their participation. So next is the results of the study. So the questionnaire includes that attitude had a mean of 4.48 and a standard deviation of 1.36. Perceived behavior control had a mean of 5.15 and a standard deviation of 0.94. Perceived normative pressure received a mean of 4.17 and a standard deviation of 1.8, and intention had a mean of 4.43 and a standard deviation of 2.23. And so with that, these numbers basically represent the mean and the standard deviation of the theory of planned behavior variables. So based off the mean and standard deviation of attitude, it is pretty safe to say that attitude is a predictor of intention, and same can be said for perceived normative pressure. However, perceived behavior control is a little on the weaker side of the spectrum, meaning that control is not much of a factor in predicting parents' intention to get their children vaccinated for coronavirus. And so next, you have the research hypothesis uses a regression analysis following the theory of planned behavior model. And so with the regression analysis, that basically presented that attitude attitude was the strongest predictor. Perceived normative pressure was another strong predictor, and perceived behavior control, as stated before, was a weaker predictor of intention. And so, with these numbers, basically these numbers that come from the regression model, they identify the relationship between two variables. So all these numbers are saying is that attitude and perceived normative pressure are a stronger indicator, and perceived behavior control is a weaker indicator. And so you can tell that by looking at the standard deviation and the numbers. So considering that, particularly for attitude, considering that attitude had a standard deviation of 1.36, we can go ahead and say that it's a pretty strong predictor, because the higher the higher your standard deviation is, the more it appears that the variable is intended to be a weaker variable. Next is a graph. So this is a linear regression plot. So this is just physically showing the relationship between the two variables. So for this example, the lines for perceived normative pressure are increasing, which just basically intends that the intention of engagement in a behavior are also increasing. And you can see the same for intention, as well as, it doesn't show attitude, but for perceived behavior control, you can tell that the line isn't increasing as much as intention and normative pressure. And so next is a bar graph. And so for the bar graph, this just basically shows that the more the bars increase, the more an individual's attitude is to predict the intention of their behavior. And so just for example, I'll go ahead and I can point out for perceived, for attitude, you can tell that for attitude, a lot of individuals who participated in the survey, a lot of participants more so had scored higher for attitude, and so that can intend that attitude is a strong predictor. And so for the discussion portion, what does this study prove? And so basically, the regression analysis proves that attitude, perceived normative pressure, and PBC are predictors in parents' intention to get their children vaccinated. And although you have weaker predictors than others, such as perceived normative pressure, perceived behavior control being a weaker predictor, it just basically shows that control seems to have no effect in an individual's intention to get their child vaccinated. And with attitude being a stronger predictor, that can mean that can just simply mean that an individual, basically a lot of their feelings and their sense of, excuse me because individuals have higher levels of attitude toward getting their children vaccinated. It can just basically predict that the way that they feel is a strong predictor in how they behave. And so, by saying that, um, I'm going to restate the hypothesis, which is it is predicted that attitude, perceived normative pressure, and behavior control will combine to predict parents' intention to get their children the COVID-19 vaccine. Attitude and normative pressure were the strongest predictors of intention, as stated before.